The weeks following Judge Harold Finch's conviction brought a wave of change that rippled through the city. The courthouse, once seen as a symbol of injustice and corruption, began to transform into something more hopeful. People who had once feared speaking out now found their voices, encouraged by the courage of Karoline Leavitt and Ethan Cole. Stories of others who had suffered under Finch's ruling started surfacing. Stories of families torn apart, businesses destroyed, and lives ruined. Each tale added fuel to the growing demand for reform within the judicial system. Karoline became a household name, her face appearing on television screens and magazine covers across the country. She wasn't just a journalist anymore, she was a symbol of resistance against corruption. Invitations poured in from universities, advocacy groups, and even government panels, asking her to speak about accountability and transparency. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she wanted to step into the spotlight. But then she remembered the young woman who had thanked her outside the courthouse, the one whose brother had been wrongfully imprisoned because of Finch. That memory reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. Reluctantly, she agreed to share her story, hoping it might inspire others to take a stand. Her speeches were simple yet powerful. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she would say, standing before crowds of eager listeners. "I simply refused to look away when I saw something wrong. We all have the power to make a difference no matter how small it may seem. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, 'Enough is enough.'" Ethan, too, found himself thrust into the public eye. Though he preferred to stay behind the scenes, his role in arresting Finch made him a local hero. Colleagues at the courthouse treated him with newfound respect, and strangers often stopped him on the street to thank him. One day, while walking home from work, a group of high school students approached him. "Mr. Cole," one of them said shyly, "we're doing a project on people who fight for justice. Can you tell us what made you decide to stand up to Judge Finch?" Ethan smiled, touched by their enthusiasm. "Honestly," he replied, "I didn't think I had much of a choice. When you see something unfair happening right in front of you, you can either ignore it or try to fix it. I chose to fix it." His words resonated deeply with the students, who left inspired to tackle injustices in their own communities. Despite the praise, both Karoline and Ethan remained grounded. They knew the fight for justice wasn't over, not by a long shot. While Finch's arrest had exposed one corrupt judge, it also highlighted deeper flaws in the system. Bribery and favoritism weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a larger problem. To address these issues, lawmakers introduced new legislation aimed at increasing oversight and transparency in the courts. Public hearings were held to gather input from citizens, and activists worked tirelessly to ensure the proposed reforms wouldn't lose momentum. Karoline threw herself into this next phase of the battle, using her platform to advocate for meaningful change. She wrote articles exposing loopholes that allowed judges like Finch to operate unchecked and interviewed experts who offered solutions. Her reporting became a blueprint for reform, influencing policymakers and sparking debates in legislative chambers. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his work at the courthouse, determined to be part of the solution from within. He volunteered to train new bailiffs on ethics and integrity, sharing lessons he had learned during his brief but impactful career. Their efforts paid off. Within months, several key reforms were implemented. Judges were required to disclose financial records regularly, and independent commissions were established to investigate complaints of misconduct. Cameras were installed in courtrooms to promote transparency, and stricter penalties were introduced for those found guilty of corruption. These changes weren't perfect. They couldn't erase decades of damage overnight, but they represented a step in the right direction. As time passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for Karoline and Ethan. The media frenzy surrounding Finch's case eventually died down, replaced by quieter victories. Karoline returned to her investigative journalism, though her focus shifted slightly. Instead of chasing scandals, she sought stories of resilience and hope, profiles of individuals and communities working together to create positive change. Her articles reminded readers that while the world was full of challenges, it was also filled with opportunities to make it better. Ethan, meanwhile, embraced his role as a mentor and leader. He took pride in knowing that he had helped set a higher standard for those entering the legal system. On weekends, he joined volunteer programs teaching civics to underserved youth, encouraging them to engage with their communities and hold leaders accountable. Watching young minds light up with curiosity and determination gave him a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. One crisp autumn afternoon, Karoline and Ethan met at their usual cafe. It had become a tradition for them to catch up every few weeks, sharing updates on their respective projects and reflecting on how far they had come. Today, however, there was an air of nostalgia between them. As they sat sipping coffee, Ethan glanced out the window at the bustling streets below. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't taken that chance?" he asked, thoughtfully. Karoline paused, considering the question. "All the time," she admitted. "But I don't dwell on it. What matters is that we did take the chance and look where it led us. Sure, the system still has its problems, but we've shown people that change is possible, and that's worth celebrating." Ethan nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "You know, I used to think justice was something handed down from above, from judges, lawmakers, people in power. But now I realize it starts with ordinary folks like us, doing what's right even when it's hard." "Exactly," Karoline agreed. "Justice isn't some distant ideal. It's something we build together piece by piece. Every little action counts." They fell silent for a moment, watching the sunlight dance across the pavement. The city felt alive with possibility, its energy infectious. For all its flaws, it was a place where dreams could still take root, if given the chance. Later. That evening, as Ethan walked home, he stopped at a park overlooking the skyline. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink. He thought about everything that had transpired since that fateful day in the courtroom. Arresting Finch had been a bold move, yes, but it was only the beginning. Real change took time, patience, and persistence. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, Ethan felt ready to face whatever came next. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos from the rally Karoline had attended weeks earlier. One image caught his eye, a sea of people holding signs that read "Justice for All." It was a reminder that they weren't alone in this fight. Across the country, countless others were standing up, speaking out, and demanding better. Together they formed a movement, one that refused to let corruption go unchecked. As Ethan tucked his phone back into his pocket, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Justice wasn't just a destination, it was a journey driven by courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that even the smallest acts of bravery could spark monumental change. And for Ethan Cole, that journey was far from over. Weeks passed after the courtroom hearing, and Judge Harold Bennett thought he had seen the last of Karoline Leavitt. The case had been straightforward. She broke the rules, and he enforced the law. It was done. Over. Yet as he sat in his chambers, one morning sipping coffee, a thick envelope arrived on his desk. It bore the words "Appeal Submission" in bold letters across the front. His brow furrowed as he opened it and began reading. At first glance, the appeal seemed like another amateur attempt to overturn his ruling. But within seconds, Judge Bennett realized this was no ordinary document. Every sentence was precise, every argument backed by detailed legal references. The language was sharp, clear, and undeniably professional. Page after page, Karoline dismantled his original decision with surgical precision, citing precedents he hadn't considered and pointing out subtle loopholes in the municipal code. By the time he reached the end, his coffee had gone cold and his mind was racing. This wasn't the work of someone casually throwing together an appeal. This was the work of a legal genius. How could someone who appeared so disorganized in court produce something so polished? Curiosity gnawed at him, and he decided to dig deeper into Karoline's background. A few phone calls later, Judge Bennett uncovered surprising information. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just any activist or community organizer. She had graduated at the top of her class from one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. Her professors described her as brilliant, creative, and deeply committed to using the law for social good. Yet instead of joining a big firm or pursuing a traditional career, she chose to dedicate herself to grassroots causes, working quietly, behind the scenes to empower marginalized communities. The revelation left Judge Bennett unsettled. He replayed their courtroom encounter in his mind, remembering how unprepared she had seemed. Now he understood. It wasn't that she lacked knowledge. She had deliberately downplayed her expertise. Why would someone so capable hide their true abilities? Was it arrogance, a strategic move, or perhaps something else entirely? Meanwhile, outside the confines of the courthouse, Karoline continued her fight. Despite the judge's ruling, she refused to shut down the community garden. Volunteers showed up daily to tend to the plants, harvest vegetables, and host workshops for children and adults alike. Word spread quickly about the legal battle, drawing attention from local news outlets and social media platforms. People rallied around Karoline's cause, organizing fundraisers to cover the fine and donating supplies to keep the garden thriving. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the rows of tomatoes and kale, Karoline stood near the entrance of the garden watching a group of kids play tag between the raised beds. Their laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension she felt inside. She knew the fight was far from over. Winning the appeal wouldn't be easy, even with her carefully crafted arguments. Judges didn't like being challenged, especially when it came to decisions they believed were sound. Still, Karoline couldn't give up. For her, the garden was more than just a project. It was proof that people could come together to create something beautiful and meaningful. It was hope made, tangible, and if there was one thing she'd learned during her years of activism, it was that hope was worth fighting for. Back in the courthouse, Judge Bennett found himself unable to focus on other cases. His thoughts kept drifting back to Karoline and her appeal. There was something about her determination that intrigued him. Most defendants accepted defeat and moved on, but not her. She pushed back harder, smarter, refusing to back down. It reminded him of his younger self, the idealistic lawyer who once dreamed of changing the world before years of bureaucracy wore him down. Late one night, as he reviewed the appeal documents again, Judge Bennett noticed something he'd missed earlier. Buried in the footnotes was a reference to a landmark case he had studied during his own law school days. It involved a similar conflict between public property regulations and community-led initiatives. At the time, the ruling had sparked heated debates among scholars and practitioners alike. Judge Bennett remembered feeling conflicted about the outcome, unsure whether justice had truly been served. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Was it possible that Karoline's case represented another opportunity to revisit those old questions? Could the law evolve to accommodate modern needs without sacrificing its integrity? These thoughts swirled in his mind, keeping him awake long after he turned off the lights. The next morning, Judge Bennett called an old friend and former colleague named Richard Meyer. Retired now, Richard spent his days fishing and tinkering with model trains, but he still kept up with legal developments. When Judge Bennett explained the situation, Richard listened intently, occasionally interjecting with thoughtful questions. "She sounds fascinating," Richard said when Judge Bennett finished recounting the details. "But you're worried she might outsmart you." "It's not about being outsmarted," Judge Bennett replied defensively. "It's about fairness. If her arguments hold up, then maybe I made a mistake. And if I made a mistake, I need to fix it." Richard chuckled, softly. "Harold, you've always been too hard on yourself. No judge gets it right 100% of the time. What matters is how you handle it when you realize you're wrong." Though Judge Bennett appreciated the advice, it didn't ease his growing unease. He spent the following days poring over legal texts, searching for counter-arguments to weaken Karoline's appeal. Each time he thought he'd found a flaw in her reasoning, she anticipated it in the next section, addressing his concerns with clarity and conviction. It was as if she knew exactly what objections he would raise, and had already prepared her responses. Despite his efforts, Judge Bennett couldn't shake the feeling that Karoline was several steps ahead of him. Her strategy wasn't just about winning the case. It was about exposing weaknesses in the system itself. She wanted to force people like him to confront uncomfortable truths about how laws were applied and who benefited from them. As the deadline for responding to the appeal approached, Judge Bennett grew increasingly conflicted. On one hand, he prided himself on upholding the law impartially, regardless of personal feelings. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the growing sense that Karoline's case highlighted genuine flaws in the current framework. Perhaps the real test wasn't whether he could defend his original ruling, but whether he was willing to admit when the system needed improvement. One afternoon, while walking through the courthouse hallway, Judge Bennett overheard two clerks discussing the case. One of them mentioned how inspiring Karoline's story was, calling her a modern-day Robin Hood. The comment struck a chord with him. Maybe that's what bothered him most. Not that Karoline had challenged his authority, but that she had done so in a way that resonated with others. Her actions weren't just about breaking rules. They were about challenging the very notion of what the rules should be. That evening, as he drove home, Judge Bennett reflected on his career. He had spent decades interpreting and enforcing laws, believing he was serving justice. But had he ever stopped to question whether those laws were fair in the first place? Had he become so focused on procedure that he lost sight of the bigger picture? The questions haunted him, lingering like ghosts in the corners of his mind. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain about the law, about his role in it, and about the woman who dared to challenge everything he thought he knew. Unbeknownst to Judge Bennett, Karoline was also grappling with doubts of her own. While the support from her community buoyed her spirits, the weight of the legal battle pressed heavily on her shoulders. She knew the odds were stacked against her, even with her meticulous preparation. Judges rarely overturned their own decisions, especially when doing so meant admitting fault. Yet Karoline refused to let fear dictate her actions. Every morning she woke up early to water the plants, organize volunteers, and draft new strategies for the appeal. Her notebook filled with notes, diagrams, and reminders of why she started this journey in the first place. Somewhere along the way, the garden had stopped being just a project. It had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of collective action. As the days turned into weeks, both Judge Bennett and Karoline found themselves caught in a delicate dance, each step revealing new layers of complexity. Neither of them realized yet that their paths were destined to intersect again, not as adversaries, but as reluctant allies united by a shared desire for change. What neither of them could foresee was how this unlikely partnership would reshape not only their lives but also the very foundation of the legal system they sought to navigate. The appeal hearing was scheduled for a chilly Tuesday morning, and the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. News of Karoline Leavitt's legal battle had spread far beyond the local community. Journalists lined up outside, cameras ready to capture every moment. Inside, the courtroom was packed with supporters, neighbors who had benefited from the garden, activists inspired by her cause, and curious onlookers eager to see how this David versus Goliath story would unfold. Judge Harold Bennett entered the room with his usual calm demeanor, but beneath the surface he felt anything but composed. He had spent countless hours preparing for this day, dissecting Karoline's arguments and rehearsing counterpoints. Yet no matter how much he studied, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was always one step ahead. Her appeal wasn't just about overturning his ruling. It was about forcing him and everyone else to rethink what justice truly meant. Karoline sat at the defendant's table looking more confident than she had during their first encounter. She wore a plain blouse and slacks, her hair neatly tied back. There was still no lawyer by her side, but this time she carried herself differently. She exuded quiet determination, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. When Judge Bennett called the session to order, he began by summarizing the case before inviting Karoline to present her argument. She stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the judge. For a brief moment their gazes locked, and Judge Bennett felt an unspoken challenge pass between them. "Your Honor," Karoline began, her voice steady and clear. This case is not just about a garden. It's about fairness, about whether the law serves the people or controls them. The municipal code exists to protect public spaces, yes, but it also exists to ensure those spaces are used in ways that benefit everyone. Our garden does that. It feeds families, educates children, and strengthens our community. To shut it down because of technicalities is to prioritize rules over real-world impact. Her words resonated with the crowd, earning murmurs of agreement. But Judge Bennett remained impassive, waiting for her to delve into the specifics. And she didn't disappoint. For example, she continued, pulling out a document. Section 212 allows temporary use of public land for educational purposes under certain conditions. While I admit we did not secure prior approval, the Parks Department has acknowledged in writing that they received our application months ago. Their delay in processing it cannot be held against us when the law itself encourages such initiatives. She paused, letting the statement sink in. Then she moved on to another point, citing a precedent case where a similar conflict had been resolved in favor of the community. Each argument flowed seamlessly into the next, building a compelling narrative that left little room for rebuttal. Judge Bennett listened intently, his pen moving furiously across his notepad. He had anticipated many of these points thanks to her meticulously written appeal, but hearing them spoken aloud added a new dimension. Her passion brought life to the dry language of the law, making it hard to dismiss her claims as mere technicalities. When she finished, the courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Judge Bennett, awaiting his response. He took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts before addressing her. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone measured, "your arguments are well researched and persuasive. However, the law is designed to maintain order, and exceptions must be carefully considered. Allowing individuals to bypass regulations based on personal interpretations could lead to chaos." Karoline nodded, acknowledging his concern. "I understand that, Your Honor. But isn't the purpose of the law to serve the greater good? If following the letter of the law harms communities instead of helping them, shouldn't we question whether the law needs to adapt?" Her question hung in the air, challenging not only Judge Bennett but the entire system he represented. He hesitated, unsure how to respond without undermining his position. Instead, he deferred further discussion until after reviewing all evidence. The hearing adjourned, Karoline returned to her seat, exchanging quiet smiles with her supporters. Outside, reporters swarmed her, asking for statements. She kept her answers brief, focusing on the importance of community-led projects and the need for systemic reform. Back in his chambers, Judge Bennett replayed the events in his mind. Karoline's performance had been flawless, leaving him with few options to counter her claims effectively. Yet he couldn't ignore the growing public support for her cause. Social media had exploded with hashtags like Save the Garden and Justice for Karoline, pressuring him to reconsider his stance. That evening, unable to find peace, Judge Bennett visited the community garden. He told himself it was purely professional, to better understand the context of the case, but deep down, he knew curiosity played a role too. As he approached the site, he saw volunteers working together, planting seeds, harvesting vegetables, and laughing with one another. Children ran around, chasing butterflies while parents supervised nearby. The scene was vibrant, alive, and undeniably heartwarming. A young boy noticed him standing at the edge of the garden and waved enthusiastically. "Hi, mister, want to help?" he called out. Judge Bennett smiled awkwardly, shaking his head. "No, thank you, I'm just, observing." Karoline spotted him shortly afterward. She walked over, wiping dirt from her hands onto her jeans. "Judge Bennett," she said, surprised but polite. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to see the place for myself," he admitted, gesturing toward the garden. "It's impressive." "Thank you," she replied softly. "This is what we're fighting for. Not just plants, but connections. People coming together to make something meaningful." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of laughter and chatter filling the air. Finally, Judge Bennett spoke again. "You know, Miss Leavitt, your appeal has given me a lot to think about. I'll admit, I underestimated you initially, but now—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him with thoughtful eyes. "Now what, Your Honor? Now I wonder if maybe there's a way to resolve this without anyone losing." His voice was hesitant, almost vulnerable. It was the first time he had openly questioned his own judgment in front of someone else. Karoline crossed her arms, considering his words. "There is," she said finally. "But it'll take compromise, from both sides." They talked for nearly an hour, discussing potential solutions that balanced legal requirements with community needs. By the end of the conversation, Judge Bennett found himself agreeing to explore alternative approaches, even if it meant stepping outside traditional boundaries. Over the next few days, Judge Bennett consulted with city officials, proposing amendments to the municipal code that would allow for temporary community projects under strict guidelines. Meanwhile, Karoline worked with her team to draft proposals outlining how the garden could operate within these new parameters. Their collaboration remained secret, hidden from public view to avoid raising expectations prematurely. But behind the scenes, a fragile yet hopeful partnership began to form. Both parties recognized that true progress required mutual respect and understanding, a lesson neither of them had fully grasped until now. As the final hearing approached, Judge Bennett felt a mix of apprehension and excitement. He knew the decision he was about to make would set a precedent, shaping how future cases involving civic engagement were handled. More importantly, it would reflect his willingness, or lack thereof, to embrace change. On the morning of the verdict, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity. Tension crackled in the air as Judge Bennett took his seat. After a brief pause, he addressed the room. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented and the broader implications of this case, I have reached a decision." He glanced at Karoline, who sat poised and attentive. "While I stand by the necessity of adhering to legal procedures, I acknowledge that rigid enforcement can sometimes hinder positive outcomes. Therefore, I grant Ms. Leavitt permission to continue operating her community garden under revised regulations that align with the spirit of Section 212. The announcement was met with thunderous applause, cheers echoing through the courtroom. Karoline rose to her feet, visibly emotional, as supporters rushed to congratulate her. Judge Bennett watched quietly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Though the battle was won, both Karoline and Judge Bennett understood that the war for systemic reform was far from over. What they had achieved together was not just a victory for one garden, but a step toward creating a more inclusive and adaptable legal framework. And in that shared triumph, they found common ground, a reminder that even the most unlikely alliances could spark meaningful change. The days following Judge Harold Bennett's landmark ruling were a whirlwind of activity for Karoline Leavitt. News of the decision spread like wildfire, turning her small community garden into a symbol of hope and resilience. Reporters from across the country descended upon the town, eager to interview her and document the story of how a grassroots activist had taken on the legal system and won. Strangers sent messages of support, sharing stories of their own struggles against bureaucratic red tape. For Karoline, it was overwhelming but deeply gratifying. Yet amidst the chaos, she remained focused. The revised regulations Judge Bennett had proposed allowed the garden to continue operating under stricter oversight, including regular inspections and mandatory reporting. While these requirements added extra responsibilities, Karoline embraced them as part of the compromise. She knew that true progress often came with compromise, and this victory wasn't just about her. It was about proving that communities could work within the system to create meaningful change. Meanwhile, Judge Bennett found himself facing a different kind of attention. His decision drew praise from some quarters, particularly those who believed the law should adapt to modern needs. But others criticized him, accusing him of bending the rules to appease public opinion. Letters poured into his office, ranging from heartfelt thank you notes to scathing condemnations. Some fellow judges expressed concern that his ruling might set a dangerous precedent, encouraging others to sidestep regulations in pursuit of noble causes. Despite the backlash, Judge Bennett felt no regret. In fact, he experienced a sense of liberation he hadn't felt in years. For decades, he had adhered strictly to procedure, believing that impartiality meant never questioning the law itself. But Karoline's case had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the rigidity of the system, the gaps between intent and impact, and the importance of listening to those affected by legal decisions. He realized that being a good judge didn't mean blindly enforcing rules. It meant using judgment to ensure fairness. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, Judge Bennett reflected on his career. He thought about the countless cases he had presided over, each one blending into the next until they became a blur of motions, rulings, and appeals. He wondered how many times he had missed opportunities to make a difference, not because the U.J. law prevented it, but because he hadn't been willing to look beyond its surface. Karoline had shown him that the law wasn't static. It was a living, breathing entity shaped by the people who applied it. Determined to learn from the experience, Judge Bennett reached out to Karoline. They met at a quiet cafe near the courthouse, away from prying eyes. Over cups of coffee, they discussed the aftermath of the case and the challenges ahead. Karoline admitted that while the ruling had given her garden a lifeline, she worried about other activists facing similar battles without the resources or visibility to fight back. Judge Bennett listened intently, nodding as she spoke. "You're right," he said eventually. "This isn't just about your garden. It's about making sure the system works for everyone, not just those who can navigate it easily." Karoline smiled faintly. "That's why I do what I do. But I can't change the world alone." "No," Judge Bennett agreed, "but maybe we can start somewhere." Their conversation shifted toward ideas for reform. Judge Bennett suggested creating a task force to review outdated municipal codes and propose updates that better reflected contemporary needs. Karoline, drawing on her experiences working with marginalized communities, offered insights into the barriers people faced when trying to access public resources. Together, they brainstormed ways to bridge the gap between policy and practice. As they talked, an unexpected bond began to form between them. Though their backgrounds and perspectives differed greatly, they shared a common goal: to create a fairer, more inclusive society. Their alliance, born out of necessity, evolved into something deeper, a partnership rooted in mutual respect and a shared vision for the future. Over the next several weeks, Judge Bennett and Karoline worked behind the scenes to implement their plan. They collaborated with city officials, community leaders, and legal experts to draft proposals aimed at streamlining permit processes, increasing transparency, and fostering greater collaboration between government agencies and grassroots organizations. The initiative received mixed reactions. Some hailed it as a bold step forward, while others dismissed it as impractical idealism. But both Judge Bennett and Karoline remained undeterred, knowing that meaningful change rarely came without resistance. In addition to their joint efforts, Judge Bennett began mentoring young lawyers, encouraging them to think critically about the role of the law in society. He invited Karoline to speak at a seminar for aspiring attorneys, where she shared her journey and emphasized the importance of using legal knowledge to empower others. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, inspiring many to pursue careers focused on social justice. For Karoline, life became a delicate balancing act. On one hand, she continued managing the garden, ensuring it thrived under the new regulations. On the other hand, she expanded her advocacy work, traveling to neighboring towns to help establish similar projects and offering guidance to activists navigating legal hurdles. Her schedule was grueling, but she refused to slow down, driven by the belief that every small victory contributed to a larger movement. Despite their busy lives, Judge Bennett and Karoline stayed in touch, checking in regularly to discuss progress and address challenges. Their relationship evolved from professional collaboration to genuine friendship. They discovered they had more in common than they initially realized. Both valued integrity, perseverance, and the courage to challenge the status quo. Conversations that once revolved around legal strategies now included lighter topics, such as favorite books, hobbies, and memories from their pasts. One afternoon, during a rare break in their hectic schedules, They took a walk through the garden. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly turned soil and blooming flowers. Children played nearby, their laughter mingling with the chirping of birds. Judge Bennett paused to examine a row of sunflowers, their bright yellow petals reaching toward the sky. "It's remarkable," he said, glancing at Karoline. "What you've built here. It's not just a garden. It's a testament to what people can achieve when they come together." Karoline smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We couldn't have done it without you, Judge Bennett. You took a risk, and it made all the difference." He shook his head modestly. "I simply did my job. Justice isn't about maintaining order for its own sake. It's about finding solutions that benefit everyone. That's something you reminded me of." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene. Then Karoline turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing enough? If all this effort will actually lead to lasting change?" Judge Bennett considered her question before answering. "Change is slow, Karoline. Sometimes it feels like we're pushing against a mountain, but even the smallest shifts matter. Every seed planted grows into something bigger, and who knows, maybe someday gardens like this will be everywhere." His words reassured her, though she still harbored doubts. The road ahead was long, fraught with obstacles and uncertainties, yet she clung to the hope that their combined efforts would pave the way for a brighter future, not just for themselves but for generations to come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the landscape, Judge Bennett and Karoline walked side by side, united by a shared purpose. Neither of them could predict exactly where their journey would lead, but they were committed to seeing it through, together. Months passed, and the ripple effects of Judge Harold Bennett's ruling began to spread far beyond the small community garden. The decision set a precedent that inspired other towns and cities to reconsider how they handled similar grassroots initiatives. Activists across the country cited Karoline Leavitt's case as proof that ordinary people could challenge outdated systems and win. What started as a local effort blossomed into a national movement with Karoline at its forefront. Karoline threw herself into expanding her work, traveling from state to state to help communities establish their own gardens, urban farms, and cooperative spaces. She became a familiar face on talk shows and podcasts, using her platform to advocate for policy changes that supported civic engagement. Her message was simple but powerful. Laws should serve the people, not hinder them. Though she remained humble about her role, others saw her as a trailblazer, a woman who had dared to stand up to authority and succeeded. Judge Bennett, meanwhile, found himself transformed by the experience. Once known for his strict adherence to procedure, he now earned a reputation as a forward-thinking judge willing to adapt to modern realities. His task force proposal gained traction, leading to the formation of a committee tasked with reviewing and revising municipal codes nationwide. Lawyers, activists, and policymakers joined forces to create guidelines that balanced regulation with flexibility, ensuring public spaces could be used creatively without compromising safety or fairness. The partnership between Judge Bennett and Karoline grew stronger with time. They continued to collaborate, exchanging ideas and supporting each other through challenges. Their friendship deepened, built on mutual respect and shared values. Though their paths often diverged, hers in the field, his in the courtroom, they remained connected by their commitment to justice. One evening, after delivering a keynote speech at a conference, Karoline received an unexpected call from Judge Bennett. His voice sounded unusually hesitant over the phone. "Karoline," he began, "I've been thinking, I'm planning to retire early." She paused, surprised. "Really? Are you sure?" "Yes," he replied firmly. "I've spent decades enforcing laws, but I realize now that my purpose isn't just to uphold the system, it's to improve. There's so much more I can do outside the courtroom. Mentor young lawyers, write about reform, maybe even teach. I owe it to myself and to people like you to keep pushing for change." Karoline smiled, touched by his words. "That's wonderful news, Judge Bennett. You'll make a great teacher." He chuckled softly. "Let's hope so. But there's one thing I need your help with first." "Anything," she said without hesitation. "I want to visit some of these projects you've helped start. See firsthand how they're making a difference. Would you mind showing me around?" "Of course not," Karoline exclaimed. "It would mean a lot to everyone involved. Let's plan it soon." A few weeks later, Judge Bennett joined Karoline on a tour of several community-driven initiatives. They visited urban gardens tucked between skyscrapers, rooftop farms buzzing with activity, and vacant lots transformed into vibrant gathering spaces. At each stop, locals greeted them warmly, eager to share stories of how these projects had improved their lives. For Judge Bennett, it was eye-opening. He saw the tangible impact of what he and Karoline had fought for, the smiles on children's faces, the pride in volunteers' voices, the sense of belonging that came from working together. At one site, a young girl approached him shyly, holding out a bouquet of freshly picked flowers. "Thank you for helping us," she whispered before running back to her friends. Judge Bennett felt a lump rise in his throat. In that moment, he understood why Karoline dedicated her life to this cause. It wasn't just about growing food or reclaiming land. It was about nurturing hope. As their journey continued, Judge Bennett noticed something else: the growing network of connections linking these projects. Communities weren't working in isolation anymore. They were sharing resources, strategies, and support. Karoline had played a key role in fostering this spirit of collaboration, encouraging people to see themselves as part of a larger movement. It reminded him of the legal system itself, a web of relationships designed to uphold justice when nurtured correctly. By the end of their trip, Judge Bennett felt invigorated. He returned home with renewed clarity about his next steps. Retirement wouldn't mean stepping away entirely. It would mean shifting his focus to areas where he could have the greatest impact. He began writing articles and giving lectures on the importance of adaptive governance, drawing on both his legal expertise and the lessons he'd learned from Karoline. His words resonated with audiences, sparking conversations about how institutions could evolve to meet changing societal needs. For Karoline, the momentum only grew. With Judge Bennett's blessing, she expanded her efforts internationally, partnering with organizations in Europe, Asia, and Africa to promote sustainable development and community empowerment. Her methods varied depending on the region, but her core philosophy remained the same: listen to the people, trust their instincts, and give them the tools to succeed. Despite their busy schedules, Judge Bennett and Karoline stayed close. They exchanged letters and emails regularly, updating each other on their progress and offering encouragement during tough times. Occasionally, they met in person, reliving old memories and dreaming up new possibilities. Their bond had become a cornerstone of their lives, a reminder that meaningful relationships could transcend differences and endure adversity. Years later, as Karoline stood on stage accepting an award for her contributions to social justice, she took a moment to acknowledge Judge Bennett. "This wouldn't have been possible without him," she told the audience. "He taught me that true leadership means being open to learning, even when it challenges everything you thought you knew." In the crowd, Judge Bennett watched proudly, his heart swelling with gratitude. Their unlikely alliance had sparked a wave of change neither of them could have predicted. Together, they had proven that justice wasn't just about following rules. It was about creating opportunities for everyone to thrive. As the ceremony ended, Karoline sought out Judge Bennett among the attendees. When she found him, she pulled him into a warm hug. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." He patted her shoulder gently. "No, thank you. You reminded me why I fell in love with the law in the first place." They parted ways shortly afterward, each returning to their respective missions. Yet they carried with them the knowledge that their partnership had left an indelible mark, not only on the legal system but on countless lives. Through their courage, determination, and willingness to embrace change, they had shown the world what was possible when people worked together toward a common goal. And though their story might fade from headlines over time, its legacy would endure in the thriving gardens, the reformed policies, and the hearts of those who believed in the power of justice to transform the world.